and thinking about story about even like from a pay perspective of, what are the stories we're celebrating, right? Of, when we highlight people in the company, is it the person who works, 80 to 100 hours a week, or who's
Mm.
always available or gets things done? I used to work at a financial services company about 20 years ago and worked in the reward and recognition department for a little while. And we had this one employee, it was a division of 10,000 people, and we had these customer experience leadership awards, right? And this one employee at a banking center ended up giving their kidney for a customer, right? So that person won this award, was highlighted for a long time. And I was like, because I used to always laugh because I'd be like, that person is amazing. And I'm sorry, I'm probably not giving my kidney for all the customers that come through. I mean, it was just.
Leadership Story Talks, where we discuss the practices that engage, motivate, develop, retain, and attract people to businesses. We'll give you principles and tools based on real-world stories to leverage listening and storytelling to become a better leader and management professional. Leadership Story Talks is produced by Narrative, a company that focuses on personal storytelling for business.
Welcome to Leadership Story Talks. I'm Jerome CEO of Narrative.
And I'm Julienne Ryan, and I'm happy to be back with you, Jerome, and with our newest guest.
Yes, absolutely. And before I move on to introducing Sally, I want to remind our listeners to subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, and check out our YouTube channel in this episode's notes, as well as narrative.com/podcast, where you can find our archive of episodes. So without further ado, our guest today is Sally Loftis. She's the managing director at Loftis Partners, a 100% woman-owned human resources consulting firm located in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. That sounds beautiful. Loftis Partners specializes in strategy, people, facilitation, and pay justice. Since launching in August 2020, Sally and her firm have worked with 54 clients across 3 continents. Sally works at the intersection of human resources, organizational development, and social justice. She's a human resources consultant who specializes in people strategy and pay equity, and has completed her master's thesis on pay equity in nonprofits. Sally, welcome to the show. Great to have you.
Thank you. I'm always amazed at the introduction. I'm like, that feels long. But hi.
Well,
Welcome.
yes, welcome, and it's very, very aligned with and really we were excited to have you because it's aligned with so many guests that we've had in the past talking about employee well-being from different perspectives, but we haven't really addressed as specifically as you do pay equity. So I'd love to, we talk a lot about engagement here, and I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about the connection between pay equity and employee engagement.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think really kind of the summary statement on that is that the conversations you're having with your employees, if they feel adequately paid, and if they don't, those conversations are different,
Mm.
especially with the increased cost of living. And, are you engaging people who are just trying to survive day to day and pay their bills? Or are you engaged with people who have the capacity to dream and innovate for your company because those day-to-day concerns are taken care of?
Yeah, yeah. Now, how did you come to sort of want to specialize in this area of pay equity, if I'm characterizing that well?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. I think, a couple of things. One is thinking about how I grew up. I had one of my parents was a small business owner. Another parent worked for a nonprofit. Actually, then my caregivers were working for a nonprofit. So I kind of grew up working in the margins and seeing people working in the margins of the community with people who always didn't feel seen or heard. And so that was kind of how I was brought up. And then I went into human resources, even though some of my professors wanted me to go into accounting. But I did not do it and or go to law school. And I went into human resources because I love the people aspect of it, right? You're connecting with people on a one-on-one level. And what I found is that kind of in the last 30 years working in human resources is that pay is connected to every part of the employee experience in some way.
Mm.
And it's kind of what I call it, like a linchpin, a systemic change. And so, because once you change that, it's going to be connected to a whole bunch of other stuff and make a significant shift in your business.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead, Jules.
Yeah, and I think this is wonderful to hear. First of all, the backstory about what
Hmm.
informs your work. And secondly, when I was reading about you, I was more curious because one of the key words we always hear about on the HR side, when you're either recruiting somebody or promoting them or rewarding them, is transparency. It's always
Hmm.
a challenge and an
Hmm.
opportunity because people like to go in and knowing that they made a
Hmm.
responsible deal for themselves, that they weren't
Hmm.
shortchanged. So I'd love you at some point in the conversation
Hmm.
to build on that about what you do to coach people on developing transparency.
Yeah, we can definitely talk about that because sometimes we think transparency is legal compliance, and it's a lot more
Mm.
than that. So,
Yeah. So how does that actually, we might as well do that now. What do you think, Jules?
sure.
I think I opened up a door there.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's right. So yeah, how do you sort of create, how do you have those conversations or that coaching, as Jules said, around transparency?
So let's just talk about pay transparency to use it as an example. So, in the United States, and I mean, this is happening in other countries as well, but I'll just use the United States. There are certain cities, territories, states that have passed pay transparency laws. For the record, every one of those is different in how they're applied. So, it's not universal approaches. So you've got to look at the details there. But second is that a lot of times people will say, well, we'll just be compliant. And it's typically an organization of a certain size has to post the salary range for a job opening out on the
Mm,
website. So that's kind of the gist of what happens. And what people will do sometimes will just comply and not think internally. So for the employees that are at that organization who are doing their compliance and they've never had a conversation, they may be out looking at jobs, which happens all the time. If you think your employees aren't looking, they are, and find out that somebody in a similar role is actually being hired at a higher rate, right, than
mm,
them. And it's the first time they've seen maybe the full salary range for the
mm,
role they're in, or maybe it's a higher salary range that they're in. And so they're starting to question, right? Question the organization, like, what's going on there? So it's kind of eroding trust. And then on the other side, of that is that for the candidates who are coming in, sometimes people will do pay transparency and there's the example of, I think it was like Netflix in New York, whenever they posted something that was like 90 to 900,000, right?
Oh,
Right. I mean, how helpful is that? So, this is really like when you think about your first impression is always your best impression, right? Of from an employer perspective of you need to, you need to decide what transparency means to you. It can be just compliance, but also how can you have a conversation
mhm.
about, with your hiring people of like, hey, this is our range. This is why we pay this way. This is how you can potentially move up in pay when you're working for us, things like that. People are really looking for clear pathways. And
Mm,
pay transparency is one of those ways to really kind of talk through those clear pathways for growth.
mm,
Yeah.
yeah.
Thank you. Because a lot of times there's an inverse reward. The new person on the block gets a significant increase or hitting the top end of the range, where
Hmm.
the incumbents who have been in the organization have not seen that substantial increase. So you get diminishing effect of that whole process. I appreciate your answer.
Well, and I mean, to your point, there's research out there about if you leave an organization, you're probably going to make a little over 7% more than you're making now. But if you stay, you're only going to make 5% more.
Hmm.
Mm,
And 2% as you get higher in pay is pretty significant. So, yeah, I mean, it makes sense that people are wanting to jump jobs because they can increase their pay faster by doing that than staying with an organization.
hmm Yeah. So now are those the kinds of conversations you have as well in your
Hmm.
work and consulting in terms of what do we do about that
Hmm.
discrepancy, given that,
Hmm.
there's greener pastures somewhere else, on average at least.
Hmm.
I'm sure that I'm pretty sure that I'll have a better salary somewhere else. So what actually
Hmm.
engages me to stay in the organization?
Yeah, a couple of things. In the assessments that we do, it may come out that there's some salary compression happening at the organization internally that's super common right now because one is that frontline workers, kind of in the last, I think it's 3 or 4 years, they've gotten a 20% increase in general,
Wow.
which has been great. Still not enough, but has been great. And then kind of the higher levels of leadership have gotten increases, but the people in the middle is where the pinch is really happening right now. And that's actually where you'll see the labor market be the tightest right
Mm,
now. And so that's kind of conversations we have with people. But then also, typically, I'm asking organizations, so who are you competing with for talent?
mm,
Right? So typically you're looking at peers, but now that people are jumping across sectors and industries and things like that, it's really looking at kind of updating your internal assumptions as an organization of like, who are we really competing against? Looking at when people leave the company, where are they going? Who are we trying to be like?
Mm,
If you're in a growth atmosphere, then you probably need to benchmark your salaries to some growth companies that are doing the same. I mean, so it's really, I tell people you've got to really develop like where are you willing to compete in the market and not.
mm.
Because I have a lot of groups who are like, well, I can't pay like these big tech companies. Well, you don't have to, but if you have a clear value proposition that you can give to people, that makes huge inroads with building trust and potentially having people stay with you.
mm,
Yeah. Yeah. Makes sense. I'm wondering, we started this podcast, just as, I think, maybe just as vaccines had arrived or something like that, or maybe it was
yes,
Hmm.
a little bit
we
before,
needed people to
right?
talk
Wow.
to besides
Yeah.
ourselves.
Yeah, and but what I mean is that it was still
Uh-huh.
pretty much pandemic time, and
Yes.
and at that time we were talking about the Great Resignation, the
Mhm.
war on talent,
Mhm.
and we were also talking about something that I saw and that I read out from your
Mhm.
bio,
Mhm.
social justice, was
Mhm.
becoming something that many, many people had talked for many, many, many years. But
Mhm.
suddenly, things were really boiling and corporations started to pay attention.
Mhm.
And policies were put in place, and those
Mhm.
terms, social justice, social awareness, et cetera,
Mhm.
were being
Mhm.
used. I wonder, how did that, I know you started this
Mhm.
business in 2020. How
Mhm.
did the pandemic what did the pandemic do for you in terms of, your business and how you think about pay equity? What would you say the difference was pre-pandemic and
Mhm.
pandemic and then post-pandemic?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will say, I had just completed kind of my research, my graduate thesis in 2020 around
Mm,
pay equity.
mm,
And so I kind of already been working in it for a while. So I already knew it was out there, but nobody was really talking about it.
mm,
So the pandemic just amplified the message for me
mm,
because unfortunately, there we've had inflation in the United States, which continues to be an issue. We've had people change, the workplace has completely changed, right? And so there's that. And then there's also this, the systemic changes in equity. So a lot of organizations, in 2020 and even now, really focused on kind of building awareness and education in the social justice space. Then kind of maybe started working on policies, internally, how teams work, things like that. And then got to systemic changes and kind of faltered.
mm,
And pay equity is a systemic change for that work because it cuts across all people. And the work we do in that, like a pay equity assessment, we're able to pull out and see, are there any kind of demographic identities that are falling through the cracks in pay? And typically there's not, policies of like, okay, let's pay women less. It's not typically, that there may be, but they wouldn't be my client. So, it's typically there's kind of unconscious bias in there. And it's because of how we've set up some of the qualifications for how people get pay. We've maybe limited it to a single way to increase pay. We've maybe put requirements on things that really don't need to be requirements to do a job. I mean, there's a lot of pieces going into that really is just a whole new conversation now, right? Everybody's identities have changed from the
Mm.
pandemic. Every organization's identity. So everybody's kind of going through and updating with some sense of stability right now. Of like, okay, who are we post pandemic and what do we think? And I think there was a shift also in people understanding how valuable employees are.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah.
And one of the things that's been interesting to listen to clients and
Mhm,
of different levels, whether it's coaching and workshops, is how
mhm,
um, the hybrid and also remote environments have changed some of the negotiations of what salaries are and where their headquarters are and what's the
mhm,
expectation. It became a bargaining chip and a form of currency as well. So I'm
mhm.
just curious of how you are coaching your clients to look at this whole relationship or contract or, contract with their employees.
Yeah, that's also a great question. And around kind of geographic location and how that works, there were a lot of organizations who shifted to maybe remote first in this. And then you're dealing with people who are located all over the country and maybe all over the world, right? Working for your organization. And so if you just look at a map of the United States, let's say, and look at the average cost of living across all 50 states, you're going to get a different number for every single state. So if you're trying to pay based on the cost of living for every state, you're going to have a very complicated compensation model that your HR people are going to be really mad about because they have to implement it, right? And they have to, continuously ask questions. So a lot of times I'm coaching organizations kind of on two things. One is figuring out, what do you want to do with geographic location? Do you want to set it to where your headquarters are and you just say that and say, this is how we pay and this is what we track, and really kind of just be explicit about that? I think it's much more difficult, like I said, to kind of do geographic pay based on different regions. I mean, I see some people who may be like, we have employees in these three cities, so, and then it's also having a, kind of a sub conversation of that, of like, well, what happens if somebody, I'm paying them, they live in New York City and they move to Raleigh, North Carolina,
Mm.
right? Which would be about a $35,000 difference in cost of living. So I'm typically saying, I'm one of those who I'm like, you're not going to decrease their pay because they're going to leave. Number
Mm.
one. And so it's talking through those situations from a social justice lens and saying, why did they move? Is it any
Mm.
of
Hmm.
my business? Number one, because they could have moved because they need to go take care of a family member, right?
Mhm.
And they have these huge caregiving responsibilities, or they move because it is cheaper to live there. And so now they can afford for their kid to go to college. You know what I mean? So a lot of times we have this view of employees trying to beat the system, which
Mm.
I am, you kind of get into McGregor's X and Y theory around, like some of that. I'm not a fan of that. I think the other piece to kind of come back to storytelling is I encourage people, talk to your employees, listen to them, have a conversation with them. How do you know when you're being paid fair? How do you know when you're being paid enough? What are the benefits that mean the most to you? Whenever you're looking at other jobs, where are you looking? How are you coming up with that conversation? Because it opens up the conversation, number one, to kind of demystify pay, which is like this like secret code we don't talk about in work, right? Two is you're building a relationship with your employees.
Mhm.
And what I found in kind of my thesis research is that there was a lot of research around leadership pay equity, but there was not around frontline pay equity. And so it's really, I mean, employee voice and story is critical to pay equity.
Mm.
And thank you for bringing that up because It is a topic of conversation, like many other tough conversations. You don't want people learning about it on the street. So you want your employees to tell you where they're getting their information as well. And a lot of it was sometimes wrong or inappropriate, but it
Mm-hmm.
created such a dissonance between what employees were reading or people that were potential employees were reading versus what we were sharing and saying, well, this is the range and this is how we got to the market. And when you get that, you're like, it's not jiving. So, I appreciate you bringing that up and just kind of, elevating the importance of doing that.
Well, and to your point, like there's an element of humility in doing that,
Mhm.
right? To be like, hey, we may not have this right. Like, oh, that's, for instance, I joke, I'm like, younger generations are more equipped to talk about pay
Mhm.
than almost the HR people at this point. I'm not on TikTok, but you can learn so much stuff about pay equity on TikToks. I hear about it all the time.
Uh,
But I mean, like those kinds of things. So, there's a element of like, oh, maybe we do have an antiquated assumption in our pay ranges, and we need to revisit that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And the point about there's 2 points really. One is about the information that's so easily available. So trying to keep something sort of secret or people are going to find out. I mean, I'll always remember my one of my first jobs, in finance. My contract was up for renewal, and I knew that my boss wanted to, hire me, et cetera. And so I came in a pretty good position. And I remember speaking to the HR people, and everything was going well. And then we got to the pay question. And I had learned what I should be paid for the position that was going to be offered to me from a friend who had worked in that very same position. And yet there was so much tentativeness about, at first they gave me a number that was lower than that. So I knew, I was like, well, I mean, there's somebody working just down the hall, same position, it's making the same, like, why wouldn't I get that money right now? So what is this negotiation tactic? What's the point of it? That's just going to make me want to leave. And this was, 20 plus years ago. But so that's one number. And now we have so much access to information, So yes, you can still talk to the person who's been in that position, but you can find them on TikTok, you can find all this stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
So why are you trying to hide something like that? And then I think the second thing is related to what you were saying earlier, is learning about the person. What is their story? We see this in our work all the time, right? When I run a workshop and someone is telling their story about what they do and how it's connected to their engagement and selling their products or services, um,
Mm-hmm.
through listening to that story, we learn so much about their priorities and what actually motivates them that
Mm-hmm.
we often do this kind of fishbowl sort of format where we have people from different departments who
Mm-hmm.
are listening. So even if we're working with a sales team
Mm-hmm.
on telling the best story possible so that people will buy more of your products,
Mm-hmm.
um, you're hearing things because they're telling it from a personal perspective and a lived experience. The HR person is learning a tremendous amount from that story, and they can use that. The marketing person is the direct, whoever's
Mm-hmm.
in that room, you're getting
Mm-hmm.
so much from just listening. And I think that's what I'm getting from what you're saying is
Mm-hmm.
that lineup of, we're listening, we're curious about your story, tell us your story, and then we can come back to you with an offer
Mm-hmm.
that's going to be much more precise and specific to your needs. So
Mm.
yeah, I'll get off my soapbox now.
No, I love and thinking about story about even like from a pay perspective of, what are the stories we're celebrating, right? Of, when we highlight people in the company, is it the person who works, 80 to 100 hours a week or who's
Mm.
always available or gets things done? I used to work at a financial services company about 20 years ago and worked in the reward and recognition department for a little while. And we had this one employee, it was a division of 10,000 people, and we had these customer experience leadership awards, right? And this one employee at a banking center ended up giving their kidney for a customer, right? So that person won this award was highlighted for a long time. And I was like, because I used to always laugh because I'd be like, that person is amazing. And I'm sorry, I'm probably not giving my kidney for all the customers that come through. You know, I mean, it was just, we would
Bar is too
laugh.
high.
Right. And then the bar was too high.
Oh,
Now
God.
that's nothing against that
But
person.
no,
Holy
I
cow,
know. We just
right?
had to laugh.
Holy, you're like, but you're just like, you want me to give my kidney?
Yeah.
To this. So it's just even thinking about how can we promote diverse stories of experiences, right? Of like, this person is a great employee, for, something beyond extraordinary measures.
Yeah. Yeah.
And here's the other thing to what you just said earlier about the ability to be transparent and also admit, like sometimes you're not caught up with all the information. I remember
Mhm.
hearing this is the compensation survey, like it was gospel truth was coming down on hot, never questioning till there was one scene in one office where I had somebody dig into it and we realized we were polling the wrong people on what their salary was. And it was like, oh no, 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 we're not good. And that opened up a whole can of worms, but it actually remedied a couple of things. But so it's kind of always
Mm,
being curious and critical.
mhm.
So I appreciate that you're actually out there and doing the work that you.
Well, thank you. And I love, kind of something that came up for me when you said that is that pay equity is one of those that's not a leading indicator kind of
Mhm,
work, right? You're going to have, when you think about leading and lagging indicators, you might have some initial, like, okay, people are starting to accept more roles with us, or, people are starting to stay longer, but it's typically you're going to see more of the benefits of that over the long term in those kinds of indicators. So it is pretty strategic long term work, which we're not always into these days.
mhm,
Yeah. 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 Absolutely. And just that, what you said, Jules, about, the example you gave, well, that opened up a can of worms, right? I think there's also that willingness to go to a place where, okay, this might be a can of worms, this may not be, but I'm still going to ask the question. I'm still going to open that box, right? Because on the other end of that, once you come out the other side, there's something beneficial and positive because you've created that real transparency, and that's how you build trust. So it all makes a lot of sense, and I love where we've sort of landed around, this idea of, look at the individual, give voice to as many people as possible, as opposed to just the one who gave their kidney, and then you're setting an impossible bar. But that again lines up with a lot of our work with, trying to get as many stories as possible that are representative of the whole, so that you don't go down this kind of this route of trying to, here are my three storytellers, and we're just keep repeating
Hmm.
those same stories.
Hmm.
That doesn't benefit anyone. So it's interesting to see that link with your work as well. So Sally, I'm curious. There's a
Hmm.
question that we ask of all of our guests here, and I'll ask you as well, which is, what's an experience that you've had in your life that has shaped who you are today, still influences and informs your thinking?
Yeah, it's really hard to choose one. I'm gonna go ahead and
okay.
say, but I will go with it and say, I'll go back to kind of the story of how I grew up. My maternal grandparents were my primary caregivers, and so they worked, like I said, a lot in the margins of the community. They were very involved in their church, and so like I grew up regularly being in nursing homes and delivering Meals on Wheels, and that was so normalized for me that I didn't, one is I think as an adult, I didn't realize, to have a comfort level in those situations is a gift. And
Mm,
then two, I think it helped me understand that relationship is critical because it wasn't just like my grandparents weren't just, I'm going to go deliver a meal. They were having a conversation. They were, regularly showing up and things like that. So I think that really shaped me into understanding that relationship is the priority over all the other pieces.
mm, yeah.
Wow,
Wow.
that's beautiful and very telling about
Oh,
what
thank you.
shaped you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and just even coming full circle to how you came to do this work, and
Mm-hmm.
you said you came from an entrepreneurial
Mm-hmm.
background, and put the pieces together as you get different fragments of the story. So thank you for sharing that. And I know it's such a difficult um, question, a simple question, but deceptively simple because you could choose so many different things, right? And that's what I always like to say as a caveat
Mm-hmm.
is that your answer tomorrow can be different. It's okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We're not going to hold you to that one answer. Go ahead.
And I will always have questions and curiosity, but one thing I would love to hear, and I think
Mm-hmm.
our listeners would like, is there a story of a client that you
Mm-hmm.
could say, well, we started here
Mm-hmm.
and through our relationship and thinking,
Mm-hmm.
we took them here and this is the result.
Yeah, I can share with you some of the feedback we've received. Like one client I've worked with, a couple of things when you work in these projects. One, pay equity implementation takes way longer if you're doing it well than you think it's going to, because there's so many strategic conversations that have got to happen and underlying assumptions that you've got to surface and discuss, right? So, and then two, HR is so burned out right now. Bless
Mhm.
HR, right? It's been a rough season, so get them some support to do this work. But in a client story we did, we typically, when I'm doing a one-on-one client work, we're going to do employee feedback groups. We're going to do a survey. We're going to do focus groups, interviews, things like that. Hear from stories, because I want at the end of the day whatever's created to reflect the employees, so they can see themselves in it. And so with this one client, after we kind of had gone through the whole project, and it took a good 18 months, we had people saying, "This is the first time I feel like I'm going to be able to buy a house.
Mm,
I'm a Black woman, and this is the first time I ever feel like I've been heard,
Hmm.
and compensated,
mm,
for this, or I can actually feel like my kid might be able to go to college."
mm,
Well,
Because I feel like there's not just I'm getting paid well, but there's a pathway for me to have some kind of stability and growth, in this organization. So to me, the stories are what employees are saying afterwards.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
thank
How
you.
do, yeah, thank you. How do people find you? Where do they go to learn more about your work?
Thank you. I'm in many places at once. I'm only one person, but thank goodness for social media. You can find me on LinkedIn, Instagram, Loftis Partners. Also, as a individual on LinkedIn, post pretty regularly. I have a monthly newsletter there called Fully Human Resources. Also, I will say if you're interested in pay equity work, I do offer a pay equity collective. There is a free version where you can sign up on the website, get access to a lot of tools to use in pay equity implementation, but then there's also cohorts that you can
Mm,
work together. I think one of the most important things about pay equity, to what you were saying earlier, Jules, it's important to be in community, because
Hmm.
you want a group of people that you can kind of benchmark yourselves against, but also pick up the phone, and be like, what are you doing about negotiations? Like,
mm,
I don't know. And obviously, I'm supporting in that, but having a group of people that you can talk to about that, because a lot of HR people aren't trained very specifically in compensation.
yeah.
And so, yeah, that's a great way to connect with me. I actually have a book coming out this
Oh,
year, about pay equity and nonprofits. So, just kind of follow me and you'll learn about that. Hopefully, it's going to be this summer.
Oh,
So,
great.
yeah, there's a lot of great ways to connect, and would love to connect with anybody. Definitely.
yeah. And when your
Fantastic. Well,
book comes out, we may need to circle back and see what happened, as we always say in
Okay.
narrative. What happened?
that's right. That's right. Yeah, yeah. We can have a part two. That's great. Well, these are great ways to connect, and we will make sure to have that. We'll have all that in the episode notes as well with links, so people can connect with you easily. Well, thanks so much. I really
Mhm.
appreciate your time today, and this was a very illuminating conversation, and loved all the alignment with our work with storytelling and the importance of
Mhm.
storytelling in pay equity. That's a great discovery for me. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, great. And thanks, Jules, as always, for co-hosting
You.
with me. This was really great. And I will let our listeners know, as always, that if you've been inspired by this session, we talked quite a bit about storytelling today. And one thing that really struck me that we do in our workshops, and if this is of interest to our listeners, is we have a step that's called Remember Your Heritage. And through Sally, your stories, we actually heard a little bit about your heritage and the importance of that in the work that you do. And so it's so important to kind of find that out about your employees with curiosity. And but if you want to learn more about how you can do that in your own teams, whether it's in group or one-on-one training, you can go to narrative.com, NARATIV.com, to enroll yourself and or your team. We're always ready to listen to you. And as always, thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. And check out our YouTube channel where you'll see us in a few more dimensions. And this is all driving word of mouth. So we appreciate you listening to us and spreading the word. Until next time, thanks so much. Thanks to both of you, and see you soon. Bye.
For more information on the narrative listening and storytelling method and how it can help your business, go to narrative.com.